Welcome to another episode of WireWheel's Privacy Rollup, a weekly recap of newsworthy privacy updates from the CPO, Rick Buck. How are you doing today, Rick?
Hi, Janine. I'm great. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. Thank you. Well, it seems like, as usual, there's a lot going on, and I understand there's been quite a bit of news regarding the new SCCs. Ugh, I'm going to start that over.
Okay.
There's been quite a bit of news regarding the new SCCs. Sounds like clauses that are allowing companies to take a risk-based approach when assessing whether a third country's laws and practices will now provide adequate protection for personal data. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Janine. Thanks. This is a great subject. So the long-awaited revised SCCs were released last week. Just some context. The SCCs, we all know this, but the SCCs are data transfer agreements that allow companies to transfer data outside of the EU to countries that the EU, the European Commission deems as having inadequate data protection laws. So insight and context again, what was the need for this? What drove the European Commission to need to reevaluate these things? And I think we need to look at it from a couple of lenses. One, if we look at it historically, the original SCCs were written before GDPR was a law. They were written when GDPR was the Data Protection Directive. And as a result of that, the language in the SCCs are not current with or consistent with the way GDPR is written. They're written in a vernacular from the directive. Mm-hmm. Secondly, as I've mentioned when we first spoke about this, and I think we spoke about this last week, the change in volume and frequency and intensity of data that's being collected, the technology that's being used to process and make decisions around that, could not have been anticipated or contemplated when the original SCCs were drafted. So, that needed a fresh new look.
Right.
And then I would say certainly probably the driving force were the decisions that came out of the Schrems II decision. Mm-hmm. And some of the collateral damage of that were the invalidation of the US Privacy Shield program and the calling into question the validity of as they were written, current SCCs. So that's a little bit of background. When they go into effect, 20 days after they were published. The published date was June 7th, 2021. And they will come into force beginning June 27th, 2021.
Wow.
The old SCCs won't be repealed for another 3 months from this effective date. And during this first 3-month window, new agreements can still leverage the old SCCs. Mm-hmm. And then going forward, there'll be an additional grace period where the old SCCs will be acceptable for existing contracts, but anything new will have to be under the new SCC language.
Wow.
And then certainly at the end of this 18-month period, all new SCCs that are signed will have to go under the new paper.
Right. Wow.
So let's talk a little bit about what's new in the SCCs. In many respects, the SCCs look a lot like the old SCCs. There's a lot of language that remain the same and stayed intact. But there are a lot of new things that were introduced, and I'll touch on some of the more important ones. First, the new SCCs have a more modular approach, to use their vernacular. So now they contemplate controller to controller, controller to processor, processor to processor, and processor to controller scenarios. And as such, rather than having separate forms for each of those, mm-hmm. They're now, the way that the SCCs are written is it's all in one form, and then call outs are identified for each of those scenarios under which you may fall.
Right.
In the old SCCs, they did not apply to exporters who were in the EEA. So exporters not based in the EEA were not able to. So if you were the exporter, you were in the United States, but you were exporting, the SCCs didn't apply. The new SCCs apply in that scenario. The new SCCs also have what's called a docking clause, and so they contemplate that processors and sub-processors might be involved in the processing activity, and so they're more inclusive from that perspective. An interesting change in the language this time around is the data subjects, the actual consumers, the individuals, are now considered beneficiaries of the SCCs and give individuals the right to actually get redacted copies of the SCCs from their data processors and data controllers. So that's an interesting change.
Yeah.
And then I think one of the more important changes in this is the concept of the requirement of a transfer impact assessment. So where the SCCs put the obligations on the controllers and the processors and the sub-processors, the transfer impact assessments do the initial evaluation about what's happening with it. Are there adequate data protection laws? Is it legal to be able to do what you're doing in the country you're doing it in? And then what kinds of additional safeguards might be necessary? So let me talk a little bit more in depth about the TIAs. So context. Again, getting back to the whole notion of the genesis of the updated language is, this concern that the U.S. Foreign intelligence, that U.S. surveillance, certainly under things like FISA, might result in information collected about Europeans and without their recourse. And of course, as we know, based on that concern, the SCCs were called into question, as I said before, as the Privacy Shield was invalidated. The TIA's purpose is to evaluate the likelihood that you as a company will get these kinds of requests from public authorities, and then based on the likelihood and based on the scenario, identify the need to implement additional or supplemental security measures to protect that data. And so in a TIA, without getting overly detailed, the TIAs are going to, for example, identify the circumstances for what the transfer is happening. They're going to identify the governing laws to the importing country. They're going to be identifying the likelihood of a data subject, of the data being subject to those kinds of requests. And then based on the answers to all those questions, the need for additional or supplemental security safeguards to legitimize those transfers. And then in addition to that, not just talking in generic terms, but importers and exporters will be required to give the very specific terms about the supplemental security and all of the risks that were identified. From a processor point of view, where possible, you should, where possible, the importers and processors and sub-processors need to, if they are requested by an entity for that kind of data, they need to tell the controller of that data. So this is a new obligation. They need to tell the controller of that data that they've been asked for that. There is a response.
1 second.
Yeah.
I'm having a coughing spell, so hold on.
Oh yeah, good. You okay?
I'm okay. I think it was like pollen. I was just sitting outside, so.
And you're not even the one speaking.
I know. So okay.
So maybe it's all that cicada residue. Maybe that's what's getting to you.
Oh God, that's gross. It probably
okay.
is.
I'm going to start from the top of the obligations for processors section.
Sounds good. Let's go.
Okay, so from a processor point of view, the TIA has obligations that you need to be aware of. One, if you're a processor, a sub-processor, it's your obligation to notify the controller, the owner of that data, if a request for this kind of information is given to you. You have an obligation to challenge that request from the public authority and leverage any kind of appeal to supplying that information. And if you are deemed to having to be able to supply that information, the concept and the obligation of data minimization. So only give the information that's relevant and specific to the request. And then you have to retain records that show, what was requested, what was given, et cetera. If you are a controller, in terms of things that you need to do now, there are a couple things. So from a controller point of view, one, start to think, and these are the obvious things, start to think about your inventory, start to assess your data transfers and the related third-party agreements. I would say start to think about conversations with your privacy team or your legal team and determine if you are obligated to SCCs and can you live up to the new language and the obligations within those agreements. I would start to think about doing TIAs that are commensurate with the transfers that you're doing. Think about auditing your existing SCCs and identifying vendors that or gaps in your vendors that need to be updated. And then think about building a remediation plan based on the information that the TIAs expose. If you're an importer, if you're a processor, I would expect a huge influx, a huge uptick in requests from your controllers because they are going to be obligated to make sure that downstream everything is locked up. So processors, buckle your seatbelts. You're going to be asked to do a lot of work. This is going to be, much like the controllers will need to do on their side, you're going to need to do many of the same things. You're going to need to be able to create transparency reports that talk about what you process, how you protect, who you share with. You're going to need to do transfer impact assessments on your downstream vendors, much in the way that the controllers are putting you under a scrutiny. You're going to be you're obligated to do the same downstream. Need to update your contracts, need to update your data protection agreements, and be able to report back in great detail about all the things you're doing. So, there's certainly a lot more to talk about in terms of how you comply with the SCCs. Fair amount of work needs to be done. The good news from a WireWheel point of view, our platform supports that kind of work. And so we're happy to help our customers through that process. But beyond the platform work, I think it's important to sit down internally with your privacy teams, with your legal teams, and talk through this and build a strategy that is going to work for your company on how to roll out the new SCCs. So lots to think about in the coming weeks and months on transferring data from Europe to the United States or Europe to other countries where this will be applicable.
Sounds like a lot, and it sounds like a lot of moving pieces within a company and literally having to turn on a dime to get this implemented. So yep. Great stuff. I guess, well, there you have it. And want to thanks again to our viewers for tuning into WireWheel's weekly Privacy Rollup. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at marketing@wirewheel.io. And you'll also be able to find us at the link at the bottom in the description here of the video. And as always, Rick, I'd like to thank you for sharing all of your insights in the privacy world and everything that's changing. And just tell everyone to stay tuned.
Great. Always a pleasure, Janine. And thanks again to everybody for listening. See you next week.
All right. Bye-bye.